The air inside the grand marble-floored bank was thick with the scent of fresh paper and polished wood. Charles Thompson checked his watch for the third time, shifting uncomfortably in the stiff leather chair. 2 hours. He had been waiting for 2 whole hours. His fingers tapped the armrest rhythmically, his patience wearing thin. When he had first arrived, dressed in a tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and a confident stride, he had expected to be treated like any other valued client. Instead, the receptionist, a young woman with perfectly manicured nails, had offered him a tight-lipped smile and asked him to take a seat. That was the last time anyone had spoken to him. Meanwhile, he had watched half a dozen other customers, almost all of them white, walk in, be greeted warmly, and ushered into private offices within minutes. Something wasn't right. Across the lobby, sitting in an office behind a glass partition, the bank manager, a woman in her late 40s with a sharp bob and an even sharper attitude, kept glancing at him but made no move to acknowledge his presence. Her nameplate read Judith Langston. Every time their eyes met, she looked away, pretending to be engrossed in paperwork. Charles wasn't just any customer. He was here on business, serious business. But Judith Langston had decided, consciously or not, that he wasn't worth her time. She had no idea who he really was. Charles took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had dealt with people like Judith Langston before, people who judged first and asked questions never. The bank's massive grandfather clock chimed the hour. 2 hours and 10 minutes. He clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to wait forever. Rising to his feet, he straightened his jacket and walked toward the receptionist. She glanced up, clearly uncomfortable. "Excuse me," Charles said, his voice calm but firm. "I've been waiting for over 2 hours. I was told Ms. Langston would see me." The receptionist hesitated, then flicked her gaze toward Judith's office. "She's been very busy today," she replied. Her tone clipped. Charles followed her gaze. Through the glass, he saw Judith typing furiously at her keyboard, pretending not to notice him. But he knew she did. He could see it in the way her fingers twitched, in the way her posture stiffened every time he moved. A polite smile spread across his face. "Then I'd like to speak with someone else. Perhaps the regional manager." The receptionist visibly flinched. She hadn't expected that. The regional manager isn't available at the moment." "Really?" Charles raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting, because I have a meeting scheduled with him today." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly, her carefully neutral expression slipping. Before she could respond, a deep voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem here?" Charles turned to find Judith Langston standing behind him, arms crossed, her face a carefully constructed mask of authority. "No problem at all," he said smoothly. "Just wondering why my scheduled meeting has turned into an indefinite waiting session." Judith sighed as if speaking to him was an inconvenience. "Mr. Thompson, as I said, we've been very busy today. Perhaps you'd like to reschedule." A slow smile crept onto Charles's lips. "Oh, I don't think that will be necessary." Just then, the front doors of the bank swung open. A group of 4 sharply dressed individuals strode in, their presence commanding instant attention. The entire energy of the bank shifted. Tellers straightened their backs. Security guards subtly adjusted their stances. The receptionist practically jumped to her feet. And Judith Langston? Her face drained of color. Charles didn't have to turn around to know who had arrived. The board members were here. The atmosphere inside the bank shifted instantly, like a storm rolling in, silent but powerful. The board members, for imposing figures in tailored suits and polished shoes, walked in with the air of people who commanded respect. Their presence was not just noticed, it was felt. Judith Langston, who had moments ago radiated indifference and condescension, now stood frozen in place. Her carefully constructed demeanor faltered as recognition dawned on her face. Charles turned slowly, a knowing smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. The leader of the group, an older gentleman with a commanding presence and silver-streaked hair, locked eyes with Charles. "There you are," he said, his voice carrying across the lobby. "We've been waiting for you upstairs." Judith visibly stiffened. Her eyes darted from Charles to the board members, her mind working overtime to make sense of the situation. "Upstairs?" she echoed, her voice betraying her unease. "Yes, Ms. Langston," another board member, a woman in an emerald green suit, spoke up. "Charles Thompson is not just any client." The weight of those words seemed to crush the air out of Judith's lungs. Charles turned back to her, his expression measured, his voice calm. I would have expected a warmer welcome, he said, tilting his head. Considering my position, Judith swallowed hard. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Charles Thompson wasn't here as a customer. He was here as an investor, one of the bank's largest private investors. The silence in the room was suffocating. The receptionist looked like she wanted to disappear. The tellers exchanged uneasy glances. And Judith Langston? For the first time, she looked afraid. Charles let the moment stretch before finally breaking the silence. I believe my time is valuable, he said, his voice steady. Would you agree, Ms. Langston? Judith nodded stiffly, her face pale. Good, Charles said smoothly. Then let's not waste any more of it. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the private elevators, the board members falling into step beside him. Behind him, Judith stood rooted to the spot, her face drained of all arrogance, replaced by sheer mortification. As the elevator doors slid shut, Charles allowed himself one final thought. This was just the beginning. As the elevator ascended, Charles could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone inside. The board members stood in silence, exchanging knowing glances. They had all been watching, waiting, to see how Judith Langston had handled this meeting. Clearly, she had failed spectacularly. The older gentleman with silver-streaked hair, Richard Caldwell, turned to Charles with a nod of respect. Apologies for the unprofessional treatment, Charles. We had assumed your visit was properly communicated. Charles gave a wry smile. Apparently not. The woman in the emerald green suit, Vanessa Holloway, crossed her arms. Langston's arrogance has been a growing concern. We've had complaints before, but nothing this blatant. She sighed. She just might have made her final mistake. Charles leaned against the elevator wall, adjusting his cufflinks. I don't take these things personally, he said smoothly. But I do take them seriously. A subtle, satisfied murmur rippled through the group. The elevator chimed, and the doors slid open to reveal the bank's executive conference room. It was a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. As they stepped inside, Charles noted the neatly arranged documents on the table. His investment proposal. The reason for his visit. The bank had been struggling in recent years. Poor leadership, outdated strategies, and internal inefficiencies had left them vulnerable. Charles, through his investment firm, had the power to change everything. But now the stakes were higher. He took his seat at the head of the table. The board members followed, settling into their places with an air of expectancy. Richard folded his hands on the table. Charles, before we get into numbers, I think it's safe to say we have a different matter to address first. Vanessa nodded. Agreed. If one of our senior managers is actively discouraging high-value clients and investors based on personal bias, it's not just an embarrassment. It's a liability. Charles didn't need to say a word. His experience downstairs had already spoken volumes. Another board member, an older woman named Margaret Reynolds, leaned forward. We'd like your input, Charles. You were the one directly affected. Charles exhaled slowly. Then he leaned in, locking eyes with each of them in turn. I came here today prepared to discuss business, he said evenly. But what happened in that lobby revealed a deeper issue. And if this bank wants to move forward successfully, it has to change. The board members nodded. Charles tapped the table lightly. Langston is a symptom of a bigger problem. If she treats a high-level investor like an inconvenience, imagine how she treats everyday customers. Silence. Understanding. Finally, Richard Caldwell spoke. I believe we're all in agreement, he said. Langston will be relieved of her position immediately. A decision. A shift. A reckoning. Charles gave a small, approving nod. Then let's talk about the future. And just like that, the real meeting began. The tension in the room shifted. No longer the simmering frustration of earlier, but the charged anticipation of a boardroom battle. Charles leaned back in his chair, hands clasped, exuding the confidence of a man who knew his worth. Richard Caldwell adjusted his tie. Now that we've settled that, let's talk about your proposal. Vanessa Holloway nodded. We've reviewed your investment terms. You're offering a substantial capital injection in exchange for equity and operational influence. She paused. What exactly does operational influence entail? Charles allowed a slight smile. That was the real question, wasn't it? Influence, he said smoothly, means ensuring that the bank operates efficiently, fairly, and profitably. He steepled his fingers. Which, as we saw downstairs, is not happening right now. Margaret Reynolds sighed. He's not wrong. Charles leaned forward slightly. If I invest, I'm not just handing over a check and walking away. I want a seat on the board. That made them sit up. A seat on the board. It was a bold demand, one that would shift the balance of power in the institution. Richard hesitated. That's a significant ask. Charles tilted his head. Is it? His voice was calm but unyielding. Because without my investment, this bank will continue to spiral. Silence. Uneasy glances. Vanessa was the first to break it. He's right. We need fresh leadership. And frankly, after what we witnessed today, I'd welcome his oversight. Richard exhaled, rubbing his chin. All right, Charles. Let's negotiate. And so the real game began. Over the next hour, the boardroom became a battlefield of figures, projections, and strategic maneuvers. Charles wasn't just throwing around money, he was offering vision. He proposed a multi-million-dollar investment to stabilize the bank's liquidity, structural changes to eliminate inefficiencies, a leadership overhaul starting with Langston's replacement. He demanded a board seat with voting power, final approval on all senior management hires, a commitment to diversity and fair banking practices. The board pushed back at first, but Charles was relentless. Every concern, every hesitation, he countered with logic, strategy, and undeniable numbers. By the time they reached an agreement, Richard Caldwell leaned back, impressed. You drive a hard bargain, Charles. Charles smiled. I don't believe in weak deals. Vanessa extended a hand. Welcome to the board. He shook it firmly. Victory. As Charles exited the meeting, stepping back into the elevator, he couldn't help but think of Judith Langston. By now, she had likely been informed of her fate. 2 hours ago, she had the power. Now, she was just another name on a termination notice. The doors slid shut. As the elevator descended, Charles allowed himself a small smile. This wasn't just business. This was justice. What do you think about this story? Do you believe Judith Langston got what she deserved? What would you have done if you were in Charles Thompson's position? Do you think Charles's power move will create real change? Or will the bank fall back into old habits? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed the story and want to see more gripping narratives like this, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps bring more powerful and thought-provoking stories to life. Subscribe now and stay tuned for more.